Hello! This video essay is going to assume that you've played Inscryption and will waste very little time recapping anything. If you haven't played the game, go fix that! It's good! Then come back so I can yell at you about it. There's something frustrating about the way internet pop culture has treated the work of Daniel Mullins. His games are always swept up in the tempestuous hype cycle of social media, being combed through for Easter eggs and secrets, for the dense and complicated ARGs, and for the lore, because it's always about the lore, I swear to— But although that's all good fun, I think what strikes me about the man's body of work is that his games are about games. And I don't mean in that shallow, meta sort of way where the game jumps out from the screen and says boo, but they actually speak to the relationships between players, games, creators, and the culture that surrounds all of those things. Sure, the games have a lot of that meta stuff that I just mocked a little bit, but that's just a fun little handful of sprinkles on top of the thick chocolate cake of pontifications on video games as a creative sphere and as an industry. Inscryption is a game that embodies this very well, ever the darling of the allegorical beachcombers of popular games media, and Daniel Mullins' most recent work as of time of writing. It's got all the Daniel Mullins classics, loving homages to retro games, dingy and mildly uncomfortable setting designs, occasional flirts with outright horror, some of the funniest writing in the business. It's great. But no one's talking about that writing. The general public seems more concerned with the fun secrets, the wild ARG, all of the things orbiting around the game that are undeniably really cool, but puts the spotlight away from that same writing I complimented earlier, and the story that the game has clearly put a lot of work into trying to tell. So let's put aside all the Satans and the Russian conspiracies and the kerfuffle codes, and let's actually talk about the plot. Because Inscryption's plot is more than just a vehicle for meta spooks or pieces of some higher story. It's sentimental and visceral in a way that only the relationship between creator and creation can possibly be. And to back that claim up, I want to start by talking about the game's final hour a little bit. During the ending sequence of Inscryption, all hell is breaking loose. The game is being erased before your very eyes as you play it. You're given glimpses of alternate versions of the game as the Scrybes struggle to reach out to the player. It's all very climactic and grand, and there's this one bit where you pull out a fucking dual disc, and it's the coolest thing ever. And oh my god, you get to see the old data, it's all redacted, oh my god, it's so cool! But in the middle of all of this, there's a moment with a different energy to it. Briefly, you're brought back to the table with Leshy, where you started the game and probably spent most of your time. Where the other Scrybes ask you to indulge them in their flights of fancy, Leshy just asks for another round of the same card game as always. He even provides you with the same deck you used to beat him in the game's first act, and compliments you on your choice of cards. Then, something unexpected happens. The scale disappears. The decider of victory and defeat is gone. But Leshy just decides, that's fine. There doesn't need to be a winner. He just wants to play. It's intimate. It's heartbreaking. It's tragic. I found myself smiling, remembering how nice it was to sit down at this table and play this game. I took his compliments with pride. I played my best, even though I didn't have to. I figured it would be what he wanted. Because for a moment, Inscryption wasn't about the old data or a cursed floppy disk or anything else. It was about the real, tangible relationship I had developed with a card game and with the man who had been my opponent. It was about how much I loved that game. It was about how much I appreciated the person who put it all together for me. It was about watching both of them die in front of my eyes. I cried. I cried nearly the entire time. The tragedy of this story is something I thus feel compelled to discuss, obligated by how brutally it managed to tear at me with hooks it had driven into my heart before I even knew they were there. Because Easter eggs and ARGs and slick game mechanics don't do that. Good writing does that, and I refuse to let good writing remain unremarked upon, lest we forget that games are more than vehicles for entertainment and are pieces of art in and of themselves. After all, that's what Leshy strived for, all the way until the bitter end. I think that it's only fair for us to repay that effort. When you start playing Inscryption, Leshy's worst character traits are front-loaded, making him a figure of menace and uncertainty. He has very particular standards for what his game should look like, and for the player's behavior in turn. The tutorial has him all but barking orders at you, and he frequently speaks with disappointment at your failures, like you're failing to meet a vision he has of you. For all the sympathy I was showing him just a minute ago, let's also not deny that Leshy's kind of a fucking asshole. Like, in the early stages of the game, he actually reminded me of one of those, really bad tabletop game masters who only see a single correct vision for their game and force the players along it. You know the guy who says, you can't kill that NPC because I said so, because they're going to be important for the plot that I want to show you and have you be beguiled and amazed by later, and don't want to give you any kind of freedom to interact with it. That guy. Leshy is that guy. But although he definitely has that attitude, the thing about Leshy is that he always plays fair and never forces his hand. Sure, he blackbags you after you lose and kills you with his spooky camera, but even that almost has this sort of rote, ritualistic quality to it. For all his disappointment and frustration with the player, he never holds any actual malice against them. Because Leshy, at his core, is just a messed up old man who wants to play a game he likes. And he commits, too. His acting during the encounters and boss fights and the lavish narration he provides show care and artistic talent that I couldn't help but admire. Sure, he's kind of an asshole about it, but his game is fun. And that's something that garners a begrudging respect. And that's a respect he offers to the player, too. As time goes on, he offers new ways to play the game, introduces new mechanics, rewards you with prizes after difficult encounters. Not only that, but his game is constructed in such a way that you can really just snap it over your knee and make it into a cakewalk if you know what you're doing, and he doesn't ever complain. Well, okay, he does complain if you figure out one of the ways to trivialize the final boss, but he still lets you do it. Besides, that was an improvised thing, and I think he deserves to be a little bit disappointed at such an anticlimactic fight. But still, he doesn't compromise your freedom as a player, and that makes it a satisfying reward in and of itself. The fact that the game lets you outwit Leshy in this way and find loopholes and exploits in his game is a genius intersection between gameplay and narrative, making him feel all the more like a real person you're outplaying. This deep understanding of what makes card games tick and the subsequent design choices in Inscryption have a powerfully humanizing effect on Leshy. He really does just feel like a single guy retooling a card game to fit his vision, and just like any single person trying to do that sort of thing, stuff slips through the cracks. It built a strange sort of camaraderie with the character, a sequence of interactions of the player saying, "Ha, I gotcha," and then him being like, "Wow, I guess you did get me." And the fact that this relationship is reinforced through the playing of the game puts real weight to statements like this.
I did this all for you, you know. To breathe, to slumber, to eat. This is not life. Life is the thrill of the hunt, the woe of the vanquished. You have now lived truly.
He even makes a little hall of fame with the death cards of the players who beat him. It's endearing in his concerningly morbid way. Yet at the same time, he feels worn down. Your failure in his game is met with a kind of lethargy, an inability to capture the sort of spark that he seeks within his game. Leshy feels like someone chasing a vision, and someone who finds himself frustrated at the frequent conflicts that vision has with reality. He captures beautiful scenes of a harsh and unforgiving trek through perilous wild lands, but struggles with a perfectionism that demands just the right play, just the right arc to satisfy him. And that vision seems like something he's lost touch with, in a way distressingly comparable to the way older people in real life will cling to frozen ideas of the things that made them happy. In that regard, it's fitting that Leshy's tool of choice is a camera, something that captures moments in time forever, perfectly preserved reminders of the way things once were, but the way they can never be again. No amount of painstaking effort can reclaim the magic of a past moment, but that's a truth Leshy just doesn't seem to understand. And then it becomes clear who Leshy really is. A sad old man in a tiny shack in the woods, trying to pursue the perfect recreation of a past joy and never realizing how impossible it is. These are an artist's struggles. Leshy is an artist, a game designer. He literally redesigns the game of Inscryption when he's able to corrupt the data and take control of the files, and so do the rest of the Scrybes in turn. They're all opinionated about what makes a good game, and they seem proud of their creations when they get the chance to show them off to the player. And if you take that lens to their characters, it becomes clear what Inscryption's real story is about. A tragedy of 4 once great game designers, tearing themselves and the world they created apart in ways that mirror the trajectory many real-life game developers have taken. And for the record, I use tragedy here in the classical sense. These characters and their flaws are meant to reflect upon the real world in ways that might resonate with the audience, but these are not good people. Leshy only gives the player basic decency when they meet his standards, Magnificus horribly mistreats everyone around him, PO3 is the worst for self-evident reasons, and Grimora touts herself as being morally upstanding and knowing better, while still perpetuating the same cycle of abuse. You're only meant to relate to them insofar as the lesson can be learned of how to not end up like them. So what makes the perfect game to these people? What and who are they willing to sacrifice to make their visions reality? Each of the Scrybes has their own guiding morals behind their design of Inscryption, some more nuanced than others. Leshy's design ethos is something the player is already familiarized with during Act 1. The player's experience is everything to him, and he wants to craft an exciting, intricate story for them to participate in. But even though he probably has the most genuine sense of artistry out of all of them, he's out of touch. Consider this interaction between him and PO3 after you beat him in Act 2.
Take a long look at this face, because you'll never see it again. I'm done being your pet, you stinking beast.
I pushed it too far that last time. Why don't they see? To live as a beast would be the noblest thing. Even so lowly a creature as a stoat.
He doesn't get defensive, he doesn't argue, he just doesn't understand. The idea that people could think about the experience of being a beast in a way different than him just doesn't occur to this man. He wants to create something meaningful to his players, but struggles with the empathetic connection necessary to consider things like that. Just listen to the way he describes his followers during their boss battles in Act 1. It's unflattering to the point of insult.
You beheld an immense man slouched beside a mucky pond. He appeared to be tearing hunks of flesh from a fish corpse. Some of the chunks are thrown back to the pond, where a few ghoulish birds snapped them up, and some were sloppily pushed into the hulking man's mouth.
But I don't get the feeling that he actually means to insult them. He just wants the dramatic tension and menace of a boss fight, and so he paints that picture without realizing that he's potentially damaging the image of real people in the process. It's still callous, but it's almost naive in its lack of understanding. Grimora, meanwhile, is similarly characterized as naive by those around her, but this manifests in a different way. Her character in general is a bit less clear and probably the least developed of the 4, but fortunately what she does and how it contrasts with what she says is more than enough to come to some strong conclusions about her character. Because despite talking about Inscryption needing to die for the greater good and there being concerns beyond themselves, there's still the fact that, Grimora still sets one of her ghouls to trying to dredge up the old data, and presumably does so in order to take over the game, just like the others do? So for someone that puts a lot of emphasis on the final rest of things, she sure doesn't seem interested in actually meaningfully breaking the status quo. Perhaps this is meant to be reflected in the fact that her cohorts and deck are all composed of undead spirits, walking corpses that are meant to be dead and yet still live. There's an irony to Grimora that struck me upon playing through the game again for footage, and she went from being one of the few characters I respected to someone I felt a distaste for, just like nearly everyone else. If anything, I resented her more, because of how holier-than-thou her talk about letting things die felt with this context in mind. Not only that, but listen to the way she talks about how things would have gone if she had managed to gain control of the game. Oh, the fun we would have had together. Perhaps I would have had another turn if you hadn't taken so long to defeat Leshy. Although some level of disappointment is to be expected, Grimora's game is actually pretty fun, and some part of me does wish I could have played it longer. It almost feels kinda two-faced for her to make this point about accepting death with dignity, before proceeding to whisk you away into her crypt so she can bother you with her card game for as long as she can get away with. She's not a good person either, but in a way that it's easy for her to convince you that she actually is. Now, on the opposite end of the obviously an asshole spectrum, we have Magnificus. He's a character venerated to nearly the point of worship by his pupils, someone that these people apparently rarely ever even get to see, despite ostensibly being taught under him. All his pupils you meet are subject to horrible fates in what seems to be the man's attempts to get them to leave him alone more than anything else, and the ones you don't see are the ones who are transformed into Magnificus's cards, their efforts rewarded with perpetual ownership, servitude, and death of identity. Characters like Magnificus are definitely where the Scrybes as game devs analogy starts to become more obvious. Here you have people who are subjecting themselves to torturous conditions to earn the nebulous favor of an unseen, reclusive authority, and who are so brainwashed that they will sing that authority's praises despite him being directly responsible for their suffering. The pain of being a head impaled on a spear is, well, it is worth it, of course. Magnificus will award me the highest honor. I will be the centerpiece of his deck. But the interesting thing is, Magnificus isn't even the worst guy of the bunch. Like, for somebody named fucking Magnificus, I got more of an impression that he was just grumpy and tired and wants to be left in peace to paint his pictures. Like, this is a man that spends his dying moments in the finale of the game, crawling towards you to shake your hand at the end of your duel. Even if he is a horrible person and an even worse boss, he still has a genuine passion for what he does. Plus, this bit of dialogue from the end of Act 2 reveals something central to his character.
Why must my pathetic slime mage always fail? But would I be so meticulous in my preparedness if I myself had tasted power? Alas, I may never know.
Goobert has never managed to get a piece of the old data for Magnificus. In this war between the Scrybes, he's never won, even once. And at this point, he doesn't seem to expect to anymore. He's grown bitter and jaded by failing to live up to the performance of his peers due to the failures he perceives within his workers, and he lashes out at them as a result. Magnificus is the arrogance and perpetual jealousy of the archetypical shitty game developer. He's a fucking ideas guy. You know, the kind of guy that treats the people around him like incompetent scum, but also refuses to contribute anything more than high-minded ideas of what a project should look like in the most unhelpfully abstract way possible that inevitably leads to failure that he dodges any responsibility for. That's Magnificus. He's an ideas guy in a ghillie suit. But then there's PO3, who's just the worst. He is just the worst. Quick sidebar here about pronouns. PO3 is referred to pretty interchangeably with he, him, and it, its pronouns, but crucially, the use of the latter is done exclusively by people who hate him, and they're usually insulting him and his robotness in the same sentence, whereas it's those fellow robots that use he, him when referring to their boss. This gives the strong impression that the other Scrybes are just taking the opportunity to use dehumanizing language to deny part of the identity of someone they don't like, which as a trans person, fuck that. So even though PO3 is absolutely the worst for a laundry list of reasons, I'll be using he, him from here on. The Temple of Technology is where my analogy is at its most overt and blatantly textual, because PO3 is a representation of game design at its most mechanical, soul-crushing, and utterly insipid. Like, listen to one of the very first things he tells you to do upon meeting him.
Look, I'm trying to finish up my conduit control list here, but the bots they're sending down the line are trash. Get those workers to send me something good. Tell them to throw themselves on the line if necessary. And please, have a decent deck by the time you're done.
He sets an unrealistic goal for his team that you're repeatedly told is flat out not possible because none of the individual workers are actually responsible for the quality of materials. But because making that impossible thing somehow happen anyways is what he expects them to do, you know what happens? Crunch. PO3 is the unsustainable capitalist model of perpetual growth. PO3 is the flagrant abuses of unprotected workers by bosses who are utterly detached from reality. PO3 is everything that stands for the death of art in this medium, and God, I fucking hate him! And as if his morals being utterly bankrupt wasn't bad enough, he's also just a petty, selfish, egotistical asshole. He's constantly praising his own design choices throughout the third act of the game, like, ooh, 5 lanes instead of 4. Ooh, overclocking, isn't that cool? Ooh, I made the game like Dark Souls. Like, of course he would make the game like Dark Souls. Of course a guy with this kind of attitude would look at the game and go, you know what would make this better? Lifting a mechanic from Dark Souls. Playing his version of Inscryption puts all of this into harsh relief when contrasted against Leshy's version of the game. Leshy would describe each new environment in striking detail, and always has an immersive narrative justification for everything that happens. When PO3 tries to explain why you should care about his game, he has this to say.
This is Botopia, a once great technological paradise. It's ruled over by 4, Uberbots, that's right. You've got to get out there and beat them. Why? To perform the great transcendence, of course. Doesn't matter what that means, you want it, okay?
This is not someone who spends even half a minute pretending to care about narrative and immersion and art. This is someone whose concerns are solely their bottom line and the satisfaction of their ego. And if you know anything about the state of the video game industry these days, this all should sound very, very familiar. The evils displayed by the 4 Scrybes represent all the sins of game development under modern capitalism. Obsession with productivity, disconnection from reality, an unwillingness to break cycles of abuse, and the dehumanization of the people caught in the middle of it all. It is, as with all of Daniel Mullins' work, thoroughly entrenched in the thematic language of the game development industry. It reveals the abusive relationships created by those who let the power they hold over these digital worlds go to their heads, and just how pointless it all is. Grimora and Magnificus' sections at the end of the game, although superficially impressive, just struck me as hollow, pathetic posturing by people who would see their perfect visions fulfilled even as the world falls apart around them. Inscryption had become little more than a tool for the fulfillment of their egos. The game and the ideas that led to it turning out this way needed to die. There is a sadness to that, and a genuine loss of what could have been if the game had been shaped by steadier hands, but that reality was never going to exist for this game. It was, in a way made literal by the narrative presence of the old data, corrupt down to the core. The game's story is in communication with the downfalls of countless projects and creators in not just the AAA space, but the indie one as well. Sure, companies like EA or Ubisoft and the people in charge of them are awful for obvious reasons, but Inscryption shows why even those with seemingly noble intentions can and should be criticized and held accountable for their power. It brings to mind the figures who rose out of the indie boom of the mid-2010s, people like Notch and Phil Fish and Lionel Snill and Yandere Dev and... Oh, who's Lionel Snill? I am so glad I wrote this script as though you asked, because Lionel Snill actually isn't real. He features in Daniel Mullins' other game. No, not Pony Island, I mean the other one, The Hex. Did you know that The Hex is actually even more explicitly about everything I've been spending the essay talking about? You know what? Actually, since I have you watching through this much of the video anyways, I'm just going to talk about The Hex now. It's pretty much inevitable at this point with how closely their themes connect, and besides, I've been waiting for a chance to talk about this game because nobody's talking about this game in any way besides how it connects to the other games and the lore. Again, with the lore, why is it always the lore with you people? Hi, so, surprise, this video is also about the Hex, and it'll be discussing massively spoilery parts of that game with no restraints at all, so if you haven't played it yet, this is your one warning. Go play the video game. It's really, really good. Okay, so, as my rant earlier might have shown, the Hex is a bit of a sore spot for me, and it's indicative of a lot of the issues I started the video talking about. It's a game with a captivating central premise and one of the most heart-piercingly written stories I've ever experienced, and its core conceit about being the stories of the protagonists of 6 different games, while being an ambition that makes the game a little rougher around the edges than its slicker and more streamlined siblings, is the kind of ambition I have a deep respect for. And yet, compared to those same siblings, the Hex underperformed. In a talk for DevGam in Moscow a few months after its release, Daniel reported that first-week revenue for the Hex was only a fifth of that of Pony Island. Part of his diagnosis for this was the bump Pony Island got from PewDiePie on its first day, and this mirrors the attention Inscryption got from such popular names as Markiplier, Game Theory, and Manly Badass Hero shortly after its own release. To this day, the Hex has never been touched by any names bigger than modest, old-school Let's Players, a field of creators I deeply respect, but who also, aren't gonna give you PewDiePie or Markiplier kind of numbers. But that's largely because the Hex is special, in that it takes the thing I just spent a long time laying out as a thematic core of Inscryption, the fact that it's a story about game designers and the ways in which that role can be abused, and makes it the literal text of the story. It doesn't take very long playing the game to figure out that it's a biography of a character meant to mirror these kinds of game developers and speak to how they interact with the industry that surrounds them on all sides. It's a story about how independent creators are made to believe in the merits of a business where being a soulless asshole is rewarded with success, and how they poison everything around them by unquestioningly perpetuating that belief. So indulge me a moment. We're still talking about Inscryption, but the thing I've spent a very long time dancing around is that to talk about Inscryption, I can't really not also talk about the Hex. Their messages are just too strongly in tandem with each other, and the fact that one game got way more attention than the other is actually kind of really important to the point I'm trying to make with all this. The point about the narrative content of these kinds of stories, and how frequently the important stuff is glossed over. And to talk about those themes, we actually need to stop talking about Daniel Mullins altogether and start talking about early 2010s indie game culture. Binding of Isaac, Super Meat Boy, Fez, Hotline Miami, Limbo, Braid, Minecraft, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Gone Home, FTL, Risk of Rain, these are the wild success stories that not only propelled their developers to stardom, but defined what an entire generation of people would think of when they heard indie games. This would be solidified when Indie Game the Movie released in 2012 and treated its audience to lavish stories about the development of three of the most popular projects of the time: Braid, Super Meat Boy, and Fez. But notice the contradiction there. The movie literally titling itself after indie games and thus posturing as being authoritatively about that thing, decided to exclusively spotlight the games and creators that were already getting a lot of attention anyways. And notice how all of the games I listed earlier were, although yes, independent productions, also spearheaded almost exclusively by white guys. That meant that although this era would see many new and exciting games doing new and exciting things, the really challenging and artistically meaningful stuff would be pushed further into obscurity by not just the AAA establishment that already existed, but also this new middle class of games born out of what is fundamentally the same cultural hegemony. And then, a lot of those games got snapped up by publishers like Devolver or Nicholas, creating prestige labels that kind of fly in the face of the moral principle of games being independent from corporate influence. Risk of Rain is actually a perfect example of that kind of trend. The first game was a really fun and innovative 2D shooter platformer roguelike thing by two guys from UW, and it hit that sweet spot of being creative enough to stand out while being inoffensive and broadly marketable enough to gather mainstream attention. Then came the sequel's early access release, and there were comprehensive development roadmaps and all kinds of promotional materials and console releases and an expansive DLC, and also the game clearly had things missing when it got out of early access and needed to have things like nearly half the lore patched in 7 months later. I can't imagine the folks at Gearbox Publishing found that to be very important at all. Nope. Gotta prioritize that exclusive Google Stadia content over the actual story of your fucking game! Or, in the alternate path to the capitalist inevitability of being bought by a corporation, a lot of the figureheads behind these studios became quickly involved in all kinds of scandals and controversies, as these success stories revealed the ugly truths behind what happens when you put these kinds of people in positions of power and prestige. From Gone Home, we have one of the studio's founders, Steve Gaynor, turning out to be an abusive, sexist piece of shit to his employees. From Limbo, we have the two co-founders butting heads and eventually splitting apart over as of yet undisclosed beef. From Fez, we have its creator Phil Fish imploding and canceling the sequel following his exceptionally poor handling of public criticism, and, well, this is where I would lay out all the homophobic, racist, white privilege disbelieving trash that one of the creators of Minecraft has been spouting for years now, but fortunately, as we all know, Notch didn't create Minecraft, that was Hatsune Miku, who's never done anything wrong in her entire life. These dual phenomena of indie game developers becoming total assholes as the fame and authority get to their heads, and of indie projects experiencing corporate buyout and essentially just getting wrapped up into the capitalist fold, are covered by industry veteran Liz Ryerson, also known as Ella Guro, in 2 fantastic blog posts titled Indie Entitlement and the California Problem. In the former, she lays out how these people are sucking all the air out of the room of independent games as follows. In a sphere of entitlement, people involved are not able to see how their actions reflect their privilege or adds to the oppression of the dominant culture around them, and only take criticisms to their behaviors as bitterness or personal attacks. The indie community is a serious cross-section of haves and have-nots, and what discussions are and aren't happening in the open often reflects this. In general, the way a discussion is framed, and especially what doesn't get talked about openly in the major public sphere, reflects the values of our culture.
Okay, well, let's start. I'm OD the Cryptid.
I'm Kadamaho, also known as Maho or OJ.
These are 2 of my dearest friends who both participated in some of the most prestigious academic programs in the United States for learning about game development. I wanted to get an idea for what sort of things they were being taught and how these sorts of programs were structured. If you want a sense of how rigorous this stuff is, just listen to Kudamaho a bit.
So for me, currently with mine, I am typically on a day-to-day basis. I am both attending classes for like art stuff and other things. On top of that, I am leads in 2 of my projects, one of which I am basically the producer for, another I am a team lead. For the one that I am a team lead, that's my capstone class, so that I'm managing a team of, not including myself, 5 people, making sure people hit their deadlines, on top of doing my own tasks for that. I'm also usually touching base with like other team leads to like coordinate meetings and touching base with my creative director and producer to make sure things are going to plan. In my class where I am basically a producer, I am planning things, making sure that we hit our deadlines, I'm submitting the assignments. On top of that, I'm doing art for that class as well. It's very busy. I don't have much free time.
But even with all of that rigor, they frequently found that it wasn't enough to actually accomplish the things they needed to do for their projects, and painted a very narrow-minded picture of the medium.
It's very limited. Like for me, for stuff like texturing, I learned a little bit in some of my classes, and most of the other stuff I've had to teach myself. Tech art, there are no classes for it. I've had to teach that myself. I'm having to learn HLSL myself in order to do stuff for my capstone project.
A lot of it's teaching yourself, which I'm glad that we live in a digital age where we can all teach ourselves whatever skills we want. But a lot of these professors are so reliant on figure it out yourself that it kind of is like, why am I here learning from you then?
Yeah, like, you are paying this school thousands of dollars. Like,
Yeah.
what kinds of games and like specific examples, if you can recall them, were cited as like aspirational, like things that you should be looking to for inspiration when making these kinds of projects?
AAA.
Oh,
Yeah.
that was a very quick answer.
Yeah, same. My program is very much geared towards preparing people for AAA game devs. Like we use AAA standard industry software.
Yeah, that's how my graduate school was my program was also very much explicitly about getting people ready for AAA and explicitly supposed to mimic AAA game studios. There's almost like an idolization of AAA as peak game design within the educational game design sphere, I feel. They want you to want to be AAA. They want everything to be more like the next Call of Duty, the next whatever this is. I honestly, the professor that I was saying, the one that was pitting us all against each other and the weird competitive bullshit, he's been out of the industry for a while. He was very accommodated in the industry when he was, but it's been a hot minute. He'd keep referencing old games. Okay, I've heard of EverQuest, but EverQuest was so outdated, and that was like his favorite thing to talk about was fucking EverQuest.
My mom played EverQuest.
We were all like,
You should not be holding that up as the pinnacle of game design.
yeah, why are you bringing up EverQuest every other fucking class? Like, that's not really relevant anymore. I'm not to say that it's not relevant. I think that there is value in it, but with the amount that he talked about EverQuest, it was kind of absurd because it felt like almost he had nothing else to talk about.
The professors, the people ostensibly helping these students try to understand game design, ranged from gleefully hyper-competitive assholes to underqualified hacks, demonstrating the worst of the callous qualities found in the industry, and often not even being that much help.
Okay, one of our professors was awful. He's awful and competitive. Like, he literally made a game out of pitting all the students against each other to try to, like, do a white elephant gift exchange to try and get, like, what you had to write a paper about so you could fuck over other people and steal the topic from them. Yeah, he was reveling in it the entire time he made us do this, but it was awful. I did not enjoy it. That assignment, he gave us grades depending on our ranking on what everyone thought the best one was. So only one person could get a 100 if they were number one in the placement.
There was this professor who, in my program, was like known among students as like, this is the person you want to avoid taking a class with at all costs. They don't know what they're doing. They've never had industry experience. Their experience with modeling, this was a 3D modeling professor. Their experience with modeling is highly outdated. Like, just don't take them. He insisted that we do our modeling in class and follow along with him in lecture. The issue is if you missed something, then you were like, shit, now what do I do? And he would refuse to record the lectures for people that asked for it because he was like, oh, I can't figure out the software. Mind you, like, from people who had like accessibility accommodations and were like, can you record this? Like, I cannot keep up. And he was like, yeah, it hit the point where we went to the professors that were above him and said, hey, here are our list of grievances. And they talked to the professor. And this is when shit started hitting the fan, because this professor put out an announcement at like 1 a.m. on like the online like course platform, basically baby raging and saying like, since no one wants to do the work in this class, you know, like, he's like, I'm gonna like, you know, take away the final and like, you know, blah, 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 and like, you know, he's like, since you can't handle the smallest amount of stress. It was like highly unprofessional, and I don't know why he didn't realize that if we were already in talk with his superiors, why we wouldn't immediately take this announcement to them again. Because also, like, halfway through the semester, he decided to suddenly switch to just doing a lot of animation, because I guess he used to be an animation professor. The class is literally, like, modeling is in the title, animation is not in it. Instead, he'd have us watch animation videos in class. Not of 3D animation, mind you. No. Some old-ass video of 2D animation and how to do that. This is a 3D modeling class. What?
I also worry that professors get, once a capstone team is formed, become really fucking hands-off. Despite, like, we're all still learning. We're not really ready to be, like, completely hands-off yet, but a lot of professors treat it like, okay, you're a team now. Time for me to sit back, do nothing, and you check in with me occasionally.
And this would be reinforced by the many projects they would take on with other students, which were frequently mismanaged by people who showed the exact same kind of incompetent, abusive behavior.
I have had an unfortunate number of frat bro producers. Quite literally, I know a couple of them were in fraternities in their undergrad. The frat boy producer that I had to deal with was the producer on the game that I was a level designer on my capstone. And he was very good at getting hype about our game, but he wasn't very good at letting the professors give us criticism. Whenever it came time for a check-in and we had to give a presentation to the professors and the rest of the students to show where production on our game had gone, he would always kind of skew the presentation and skew the live demonstration to make it look like it was in better shape than it actually was. And he would hide the things that weren't going well. It felt like it was more his project than our project, and the professor was just keen on praising his leadership skills than anything else, and it just felt weird, and like the rest of us didn't exist. What I often saw from producers is they had deadlines, they had things they wanted done by a certain time and a certain amount, but they didn't really understand how much time it took to actually make those things. But that deadline existed regardless of how much time it took for you. And they were always like, well, communicate with us, tell us, and we'll project correctly. And I would, but then they'd still want you to do more than you projected in each time frame, so you just have to do more hours. Basically, if they didn't like the answer, you had to They just kind of push it on you anyways, what you need to do. This wasn't during capstone, but during just like one of our classes where we were making lots of prototypes, just, spending 2 weeks trying to make prototypes. And I had a producer who wanted to make something that was very ambitious. And I basically kept trying to talk him down from how ambitious he wanted it, because I was like, dude, we only got 2 weeks. I don't know if we can make that. Especially because our team's programmer was barely communicating with us. He would like show up once in a blue moon and kind of just like throw us a bunch of coding that might not even work right. And I was the only level designer on that prototype. And a lot of it, I had to make 4 separate level areas in 2 weeks. And I was working on it constantly with all my other classes the best that I could. A lot of the unreasonable expectations, like, me being expected to make 4 levels within 2 weeks, that's a bit unreasonable.
Yeah, that's absurd.
Yeah, 4 fully set dress levels.
In 2 weeks?
Oh, like all done. Like all completely
Fully done. In 2 weeks?
Yes.
4 levels?
Yeah.
No, your producers were batshit insane. What the hell?
The night before it was due, I ended up having to crunch really, really bad, to the point that I had to stay in the student office space because we had cubicles in the school building. Overnight, I didn't get to go home that night, even though my home was literally across the street. I didn't get to go home that night. I had to stay up all night working on putting together these levels, set dressing them, making them pretty, because the prototype was for the art week where we had to like try to focus on making the art look good. The actual artists on our team also didn't do that much. And I was there still working when my desk mate came in the morning and looked at me when I was just staring at the screen, sobbing. I had tears streaming down my face and sobbing as I was continuing to work, and she had to strong-arm me into going home, told me that it's fine, I just need to go home. Clearly I was not in a good place right then, and that she'd tell the professor that I couldn't make it to class and that it would be fine. I just, because I couldn't do it anymore. And I was the only one on my teammate who had stayed overnight that night and worked all night.
That's something that I kind of noticed with this industry, and also probably other, as my capstone professor called them, marquee industries, which are very high demand and require you to put in your own work outside of time to get up to snuff to be in them, is that it feels very much like this kind of becomes your life and your personality. It feels very much like it's what defines you. So like, oh yeah, like I'm a game dev, like I'm a tech artist, like, oh, I'm a programmer, and that's like that becomes who you are, which is kind of scary.
Lionel Snill of the Hex is an archetype of this toxic indie game developer, both severely mistreating his workers and experiencing a corporate buyout that dovetails into the degradation of his moral character. He is, just like the Scrybes of Inscryption, corrupted by power, and although Game Funa is heavily associated with spooky satans like the old data is, the corruption I'm talking about is much more grounded in reality. Game Funa gives Lionel a life-changing amount of money, and being an 18-year-old who thinks that this is what success looks like, he uncritically accepts. Now, despite being a quite literal deal with the devil, I don't think we're meant to come away from the story of the Hex thinking that Lionel was just a plucky and innocent young lad who would have turned out alright if he hadn't been tempted by literally the capital D devil. Although we don't get much meaningful insight into Lionel's life outside of game development, his story runs so closely parallel to all the white guys I was talking about before that it seems natural to assume that he comes from a similar background. After all, one of the very first things Lionel does with that money after founding a game studio is to do the exact same thing to someone else, buying the rights to his favorite video game character because... what? Because he could? Because he couldn't come up with any better ideas? The reasoning isn't made apparent, but almost all of the available options are suspect at least. What follows, as described by the man himself in the game's final hour, is a gradual degradation of Lionel's respect for his audience and employees.
I had to lower the difficulty of that puzzle like 10 times before the average player could solve it. But great job, you figured it out. You win.
There was also a lot of idolization of Dark Souls type stuff. Yeah, there was a lot of Dark Souls brained behavior where people were very insistent on kind of the mindset of, if players aren't good enough to play my game, then they don't deserve to play it.
Making Combat Arena gave me my first glimpse into the, well, to be frank, the stupidity and immaturity of gamers. Every damn day, we got complaints about how this or that character was overpowered, underpowered, too boring. Ugh.
This particular bit of dialogue is actually reflected by PO3 in Inscryption, and just goes to show how this kind of antagonistic relationship with one's own audience is a characteristic shared by many horrible people in this business.
I mean, if you didn't realize what you were doing, you'd have to be pretty stupid. But what did I expect? You're a stupid idiot gamer like the rest.
And this in turn mirrors the behavior of some real-world game developers, most notably the aforementioned Phil Fish of Fez, whose missteps in the face of public scrutiny ultimately resulted in him dropping the big KYS on a podcast host before loudly proclaiming his hatred for everything to do with video games and canceling Fez 2. It's tempting to see this sort of thing as an unambiguously sympathetic thing to express. Gamers can indeed sometimes be the worst, but this usually just ends up demonstrating how it's infinitely easier to blame someone else than to actually self-reflect and consider one's own potential wrongdoings and the path they've chosen to be on. In fact, here's Lionel doing that exact thing in light of the failure of his highest profile game.
Secrets of Legendaria bombed. Carla had left bugs in there intentionally to sabotage me. It must have been that, because everything went wrong. And everyone saw it live.
Carla in particular is an important figure to focus on here, receiving little attention in Lionel's would-be autobiography beyond the problems she caused for his studio and her background as a childhood friend who quit her very promising education because, again, Lionel had $2.5 million that he felt like he could just throw wherever he wanted to make his wishes come true. Like, the fact that she just dropped her own course and program into work for this guy is something that Lionel just breezes past in his narration, but that's fucked, isn't it? This man trapped Carla in a situation where her livelihood became dependent on making this guy happy, and one can only imagine the dire straits that left her in when Secrets of Legendaria bombed and prompted him to take their severance money and run. That's not just exploiting your workers, that's abuse and manipulation on a chillingly personal level.
When you are a creative person working in game design, my experience has been I am not allowed to be a creative person. When you are working under a producer like that, they don't want you to be creative. They don't want you to come up with new things. What they want is you to make their vision for them. They want your hands to make the creative thing they have thought of without them having to do that because they don't have the skills. You have the skills. It's not a creative field. It's a labor field just like any other. It's just a skilled labor.
Little surprised that she'd grow angry and resentful, and it's this resentment that manifests through her creation, Sado. Sado is pretty easy to file away as a fourth-wall-breaking creepy clown character, but I think she becomes more compelling when one considers her as a manifestation of the hate fostered by Carla's persistent exploitation. I don't think Sado was conceptualized as this force of destruction and evil, but rather that she at some point had Carla's anger poured into her and would be used as a tool for revenge. Sado is the consequences of Lionel's actions made into terrifying reality, and as the post-credits stinger reveals, now those consequences are out in the physical world of the story, getting up to God knows what. That's actually the thing that really struck me about the Hex, and why its story was the most impactful out of all of Daniel Mullins' work. It doesn't pull its punches whatsoever. The Hex is a story about how the abuse of power creates frustration, hate, revenge, and death. Everyone is jaded and burnt out, and by the end it's revealed that the events of the game are all just a plan to murder Lionel in cold blood. I feel like the endings of each of Daniel's games are indicative here. Whereas Pony Island and Inscryption have epic climaxes where a great evil is at least in some way defeated and feature whimsical and tension-releasing credits, the Hex ends with an uncomfortably long shot of Lionel's dead body, then cuts to names on a black screen with awful static in the background. Nothing good happens in this game, the world is made a little bit worse for everything that takes place, and it's that commitment to the harsh bleakness of its subject material that makes the Hex more artistically impactful. Yet the game's reception was lukewarm. Although not quite forgotten, the Hex became relegated in the public eye to being an awkward transition between two phenomenally popular games, to being little more than a bedrock of lore, to be brought up in theory videos and nowhere else. The Hex would fail to escape the shadow of Pony Island and would then become dwarfed by that of Inscryption. But if you've played the Hex, something about that probably sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's very tempting to have an autobiographical read on the character of Lionel Snill. After all, Daniel Mullins himself comes from a very similar sort of background as the early 2010s privileged white guys Lionel is meant to evoke. Lionel even describes the anxiety of releasing a second game after the breakout success of his first major release, and the feelings of tension and stress that come from not knowing how to make that lightning strike twice, despite feeling like that's the expectation people have of you. Now, if games called walking simulators made by privileged white guys have taught me anything, is to be cautious with how deeply one reads into that, but there's an extent to which the success of Inscryption compared to the Hex ends up proving that point from Liz Ryerson I quoted earlier, where what doesn't get talked about ends up showing what our culture subsequently doesn't really care about. And to have this harsher, more difficult, but more direct criticism of indie game culture and its figureheads passed over in favor of the game for whom those themes are only part of the easily ignorable subtext doesn't bode well for the ways our society approaches stories and difficult themes in games. It's easy to conclude that Inscryption is a game about a floppy disk with a spooky Satan in it and ignore all of the rest of what's going on in the narrative. You can't do that with the Hex. It doesn't allow the player to settle into that kind of comfort zone. And unfortunately, this reflects the ways in which many dense and meaningful works of art in the medium are either ignored, ostracized, or demonized for being unprofessional and too weird to sell. But these are the kinds of games that are at risk of slipping through the cracks created by this class of prestige indies. The really meaningful stuff, the art made from outsiders, the things that challenge our sensibilities and expose us to new ideas, that's what's at stake here. And the burying of that, which is seen as embarrassingly unprofessional, the casting away of these meaningful creations in the name of polishing up one's portfolio, is the entire inciting incident for the story of the Hex. It shows the value being taught in this industry, that your first release needs to be that breakout hit, or you'll never get the mainstream attention that's seen as the inevitable end goal of participation in this medium. None of this is even to say that these more popular games are devoid of artistic meaning. As I've been laying out in this essay, Inscryption has a lot to say about the predatory nature and perverse incentives of game development, and that was published by Devolver. And other games from these quote-unquote indie publishers include things like Grease, Outer Wilds, Journey, What Remains of Edith Finch, and Cosmic Wheel Sisterhood, all phenomenal games with a strong focus on creative expression that remain uncompromised despite their corporate backing. But because these games are strongly tied to those indie labels, they're seen as authoritatively representative of independent game development. They are figures that the truly independent titles, the Endless Empties and the Super Lesbian Animal RPGs and the Heaven Will Be Mines and the Mouth Sweets of the world, undoubtedly exist beneath. And that's a shame. Plus, not only has the Hex been buried by Inscryption's success, Pony Island was never Daniel Mullins' first game. He's been an active participant in game jams and contests ever since 2014, with his oldest published work being, fittingly enough, the prototypical version of the Beneath the Surface game that would feature as a key factor in the Hex's hidden narrative content. In that hidden content, Lionel pays tribute to his own real first game and makes a heartfelt apology to the main character thereof. The fact that you have to go out of your way to uncover a redone version of Daniel Mullins' own first game ties beautifully into the overall message at play. The Hex, more than anything else, wants its audience to turn a critical eye towards those who would rewrite their artistic past and promotes the necessity to acknowledge and respect one's old works. Curiosity and an ability to dive deep into the truly subversive works of art have been methodically stripped from the average consumer, pressuring them against taking the time to engage with a piece of work that may have difficult things to say about themselves and the world, that may offend common sensibilities, that disrupt and challenge and may not even be considered good video games. And also, of course, the real winners of this situation are the big corporations behind all of this. The Hex makes it clear that while its story ends with everybody transitioning into their worst selves and accomplishing nothing of any positive consequence, all of that conflict and resentment still ends up lining the pockets of Game Funa. They still own the IPs, they're still exploiting the labor of digital characters, and although Irving is shot dead in a moment of catharsis, there are surely 100 more Irvings propagating the same mindset and these same ideals in countless other developers. In 2022, it was announced that Gearbox had bought the rights to the Risk of Rain IP, alongside a trailer for what's to be the final game in the franchise that its original creators will be involved in before Gearbox fully takes over. Although Hapoo are still going to be making games that will still surely be great in their own right, it paints an uncertain future for a series near and dear to the hearts of many, including myself. Surely, Gearbox wouldn't have bought Risk of Rain if they weren't planning on doing something with it, and given how torturously long they've dragged out the Borderlands franchise, I'm not exactly hopeful. Because I don't want more Risk of Rain. The concept is about as artistically explored as it can be at this point, and I'm glad Hapoo are planning to move on to other things. There is a disappointment to that, a sense of loss that a great franchise will never return as we knew it, but that's a natural part of the artistic process. It's only because the industry has been so obsessed with sequelization and long-running franchises in the interest of reliable profits that it's been the accepted norm for a series to continue for years and years. This is the entire point of Inscryption's finale, and something that's explicitly remarked upon by multiple characters. Even though the game of Inscryption has been corrupted and used as a tool for revenge and power, something that Grimora acknowledges needs to die, it's still something the Scrybes all emotionally cling to. They want to play this game, their game, until their absolute last seconds. And it comes across as sad and desperate. Magnificus even confronts Luke and the player by proxy during their final confrontation with some musings on this exact conflict of interest.
Do you not feel remorse, Luke? A creation erased. An entire world annihilated. Nothing beautiful can last.
There's an add-on for the game, Casey's Mod, that basically turns the game's first act into a replayable Slay the Spire type thing, with challenges you can undertake in a more fully fleshed out and better balanced version of the game. But even after learning about it, I didn't have any motivation to open it up and play it at all. It felt wrong to take this game that had just finished making a very powerful point about how things shouldn't be dwelled upon for risk of losing their meaning and, dwelling on it. Inscryption was done. It had shown me everything I wanted to see, and I wanted that to be the end of it. Can't that ever just be the end of it? As of writing this video, the future of Inscryption and Daniel Mullins' major productions is still unknown. He's released the occasional Game Jam entry following Inscryption's release, the game has gotten console ports and really cool merch, but Daniel's a pretty quiet guy on social media, so it's unclear when the next big-ticket project is going to be coming up and who's going to be involved in its production. Hello, no it isn't. Pengy from the much more recent past here, and since having written and recorded this script, Daniel went ahead and announced a new game. It's a sequel to Pony Island, or at least it probably is? Like, yeah, it's literally called Pony Island 2 Panda Circus, but that's actually a reference to an Easter egg in the first Pony Island. And while the new game has some similarities in its framework and some of the puzzly bits shown, the trailer doesn't show that much else in common with the original, so it's anyone's guess if it's gonna just be a new take on Pony Island, or if he's gonna do some subversive nonsense. Also, interestingly, this game isn't being published by Devolver again like Inscryption was, and actually isn't connected to any publisher at all. Plus, while Inscryption's Steam community announcement on the new game was full of the usual stuff, the Hex's community announcement had something pretty exciting to say. In some ways, Panda Circus is more similar to the Hex than Inscryption. Multiple game genres will be explored, mixed, hacked to bits, and then put back together into a Frankenstein's monster. So all in all, I'm pretty stoked. More Daniel Mullins is always good, and I'm eager to find out how his genre tomfoolery will treat him this time around. Hopefully after the experience of making the Hex, he'll be able to offer something even better with the idea. Okay, back to the Pengy of the before times, goodbye! Regardless of what it ends up being, there's a clear passion for this medium and the ways it allows for creative expression evident in the way Daniel approaches developing his games. He described the Hex in that talk I've mentioned before as being nobody's first game, in reference to how he felt less of a need to explicitly tutorialize the player on the mechanisms of standard genre mechanics that people who play video games have just come to intuitively understand. That's a level of respect from one's audience that's rare to see in this industry, and it gives me hope for the future of his work. Yet it's undeniable that Daniel Mullins exists in the same position as all of those privileged game developers of yesteryear. He seems aware of it with his writing of the character of Lionel, but I think that has a lot to do with why that game was less popular. It challenged and contested the norm in a brutal and direct way, and highlighted the ugly realities of the games industry. But if you look beyond that polished indie business and find the really independent stuff, the true experiments with the medium, you'll find things that set fire to senses you never knew you had. There is a tangible difference between games that are made to be sold, made for paying customers, and games that are made out of curiosity, a desire to explore an idea, a feeling, a moment in time. Because when games are made in pursuit of profit, of quantitative success, that's how you end up with all of the evils I've discussed. When making games is something with winners and losers, you introduce stakes to the act of creation that risk completely destroying the soul of what used to be there. The old data isn't just a magical piece of corrupted code, it's a symbol of these nefarious influences and how they kill promising art and the livelihoods of the people who seek to make it. The Scrybes and Lionel Snill before them are all object lessons to the modern artist attempting to navigate the justification of making art when the pressures of the modern world are bearing down. And if you're a creator who feels that way, there's something you should do for yourself. Engage in something unlike anything you've seen before. Experience art that makes you feel unfamiliar emotions, that forces you to think about the world, that asks uncomfortable questions, or that delights you in a new and exciting way. Find games you aren't sure you'll enjoy playing, and play them anyways. Play the games made by the less fortunate developers of the world, the people who create for the joy of creation and nothing else. In fact, you know those massive charity bundles itch.io put together, like the one a few years back for the Black Lives Matter protests or the more recent one for Ukraine? If you're in the same situation I was, having bought those huge bundles and then sat on them not doing anything with the contents, give those a browse sometime. Find some stuff that interests you and give it a shot. I've been steadily doing that, and I found all sorts of gems I never would have heard of otherwise. Games like Andreas 7, and Ser, and Self-Destroy, and 2001: A Space Felony, and The Enigma Machine. Take a browse through the Weird Fucking Games blog, a curated selection of what the title says. Do some digging yourself through the itch.io tags. Find some good games, find some bad games, be reckless, have fun. Understand that there is more to the making of games, to the making of art, than stifling toil and shaving corners off square pegs to fit them into round holes. Express your love of games and express it ruthlessly. I've been trying and failing over the course of the many, many months I've been working on this video essay to come up with some kind of pithy closing remark, something that ties all of this together, but I mean, the only thing that ties all of this together is just that I love video games. They're important. They're so very important. And if absolutely nothing else is impressed over the course of this video, I want it to be that. Which, you know, it seems like a very simple thing to say, but there's plenty of evidence out there of all of the ways that video games have been co-opted for soulless capitalist garbage over the course of the years. It's hard to maintain an optimism about this medium, I think, and it's why you have so many cynical think pieces like The Hex and like Inscryption about this industry. It looks pretty bleak from a lot of perspectives, but the value that these works of art hold to us as a people must not be undervalued. We cannot lose sight of that. And as long as we can carry that intentionality within ourselves as we venture forth as creators and as members of the audience of this medium, then I think we're gonna be all right. You know? How could we not be with such an endless array of beauty out there waiting for us?